The wind that swept across the Montana plains in the winter of 1875 carried more than just the sharp sting of snow. It carried whispers of stories that no one yet dared to tell. Beneath a sky heavy with silver clouds, a small cabin leaned against the storm like a weary traveller refusing to bow. Inside, a single lamp flickered against the wooden walls, casting shadows over the face of a woman who had forgotten what it meant to rest. Sarah Collins pressed her shawl tighter across her shoulders as she watched her children sleeping, their thin blankets rising and falling with each fragile breath. The world outside was merciless, yet here, in this quiet corner, her love was the fragile fire that kept despair at bay. Grief had carved its mark upon her, yet it had not broken her. 4 months had passed since William, her husband, had been lowered into the earth, and every sunrise since had been a battle she faced with trembling hands and an unyielding heart. The barn leaned dangerously, the fields lay barren beneath ice, and the bank's cold notice sat like a stone on the mantel. Still she endured, because the laughter of her children, though scarce, was a healing balm against the silence of widowhood. Every sacrifice she made, skipping her own meals, patching worn boots until they were more thread than leather, was an unspoken promise to them, that she would not let the world steal their hope. On that storm-heavy night, destiny approached her doorstep disguised as tragedy. The howl of the wind masked the thud of hooves, the desperate cry of a horse, and the final collapse of a man who had ridden through fire and bullets only to bleed out in the frozen mud of her wheat field. When Sarah heard her sons shout and ran into the storm, she found him, a stranger, tall even in ruin, his fine clothes torn and soaked with blood. A dead stallion lay beside him, its silver trappings glinting like relics from a forgotten dream. In that moment, Sarah stood at the edge of choice: turn away to protect the little she had left, or carry the weight of another soul into her fragile world. Her heart, bruised but not hardened, made the decision before her mind could argue. She dragged him inside with Emma's trembling hands helping and Thomas feeding the fire until sparks leapt like frantic stars. Her own hands shook as she cut away the stranger's shirt, revealing not only the fresh wound but scars older than her marriage, stories carved into skin by knives, bullets, and a life lived too close to violence. She should have feared him. She should have questioned what shadows chased him across the prairie. Instead, she pressed cloth to his wound, whispered words of comfort she hadn't spoken since William's last fever, and prayed that kindness, once given, would return in some healing form. For in saving him, perhaps she was saving a part of herself she thought forever lost. Outside, the storm clawed at the shutters, but within that humble cabin something stirred that no storm could smother, the first fragile thread of fate weaving lives together. Sarah could not know that the man whose life she now guarded would alter the course of her family, teaching them not only survival but how to dream again. Love, like morning glories, often blooms when least expected, opening its petals even in the harshest soil. And in this story, born of snow, blood, and sacrifice, every step forward would carry the scent of healing, of warmth rediscovered, of hope daring to rise once more. If this tale touches your heart as much as it has touched mine in the telling, let your voice be part of its journey. Share a thought in the comments. Let your heart press that gentle like. And if you wish to follow the unfolding chapters of Sarah's destiny, subscribe so you may walk beside her family as love rekindles in places long thought barren. Now, as dawn creeps across the frost-bitten horizon, we follow Sarah deeper into the uncertain path she has chosen, where each heartbeat carries her closer to the stranger who will soon become far more than a guest within her home. The morning that followed was quiet in the cabin, though the storm still howled beyond the walls as if unwilling to release its hold on the land. Sarah rose before the children, her body aching from a night spent tending the stranger, her mind swirling with thoughts she dared not name. She checked his bandages first, her fingers gentle as they pressed against the wound. His fever had eased, though faint murmurs still escaped his lips, fragments of a life unknown to her, a name whispered with sorrow, Margaret, carried like a ghost within his restless dreams. She hushed him with a damp cloth against his brow, her heart unexpectedly softening at the fragility she saw beneath his strong frame. Emma and Thomas stirred from their beds, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Their curiosity burned like kindling, yet Sarah gave them tasks to keep their minds occupied. Emma, steady and serious beyond her 10 years, carried water and gathered the last eggs from the coop. Thomas, proud as always, chopped what little wood remained, his small hands red from cold, but determined to ease his mother's burdens. Sarah watched them with quiet pride, her children learning too early the weight of responsibility, yet still carrying a spark of joy that was a healing light in her weary soul. When they returned to the cabin, both children gravitated toward the stranger as if drawn by invisible threads. Emma perched near the hearth, pretending to mend her stockings, but sneaking glances at the man stretched upon the pallet. Thomas, less subtle, edged closer, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Sarah noted how the stranger's face, though drawn with pain, bore the marks of refinement, his jaw strong, his hands calloused yet not of a labourer's kind, his clothes stitched from fabrics she had never touched in her life. Wealth clung to him even in ruin, a stark contrast to the patched garments her family wore. As noon approached, Sarah served porridge thinned with water, giving her children the larger portions as always. The stranger stirred, his eyelids fluttering open, revealing eyes as blue and piercing as the winter sky beyond the frost-flecked glass. For a moment he seemed bewildered, as if caught between worlds, and then his gaze settled on Sarah. His voice was hoarse, fragile, yet sincere when he whispered, "You saved my life." She lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the poverty evident in every corner of their home, but answered softly, "Rest now. Questions can wait." He caught her hand before she could rise, his grip surprisingly firm despite his weakness. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying a weight that reached beyond gratitude. It was as if in that moment something unseen passed between them, an unspoken recognition, a flicker of trust born not from choice but from the raw necessity of survival. Sarah's chest tightened with emotions she had long buried, emotions she dared not entertain, yet she did not pull her hand away until his eyes closed once more in healing sleep. Days unfolded with the rhythm of uncertainty. Sarah kept her children's lives steady, sending them to school each morning, though she knew their thoughts lingered with the mysterious guest. At night, they whispered about him as though he were a figure from one of Emma's storybooks, a wounded lawman, a fugitive nobleman, perhaps even an angel in disguise. Sarah silenced their guesses, but deep down the same questions gnawed at her. What kind of man carried scars from battles both old and new? What kind of life left someone bleeding in the wilderness with only a dead stallion as witness? Yet it was not only his mysteries that unsettled her. It was the way he looked at her children when his strength returned enough to sit upright, the way his eyes softened when Emma read aloud her lessons near the fire, or when Thomas proudly displayed a crude wooden horse he had carved with a dull knife. The stranger admired them not with pity, but with genuine wonder, as though their resilience was a miracle, and perhaps it was. Sarah found herself listening to his voice more than she intended. When he spoke, it was with gentleness, his words touched with the cadence of education and loss. Once, when she offered him broth from their meagre stores, he refused, saying, "I can't take food from your children's mouths." She had pressed the bowl into his hands anyway, her tone firmer than she felt. A body needs strength to heal. His quiet smile in response stirred warmth she thought had been buried with William. At night, after the children had gone to bed, Sarah would sit near the fire, mending clothes or grinding herbs, her eyes straying again and again to the figure resting on the floor. Shadows from the flames painted his face in shades of strength and weariness, of suffering endured and secrets untold. Sometimes she caught him watching her, his gaze not bold but searching, as though he wished to memorize the lines of her face. She turned away when it happened, her heart beating too fast, the familiar ache of loss clashing with the strange, fragile bloom of something new. The storm beyond the cabin had finally broken, yet Sarah sensed another storm gathering in silence, one that would sweep her life into directions she had never imagined. She had let a wounded stranger into her home out of compassion, but in doing so, she had also opened the door to fate. And fate, she knew, never arrived quietly. It demanded, it tested, it transformed. The following morning, hoofbeats thundered in the distance, breaking the fragile calm. Emma burst through the door, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her voice trembling as she cried, "Mama, riders are coming!" Sarah's hands froze upon the quilt she had been folding. The stranger, though still weak, pushed himself upright, his face turning grim, his eyes suddenly sharp with awareness. The peace they had built within their fragile walls was about to shatter, and Sarah felt her heart brace against the unknown as shadows drew closer across the snow. The riders came with the sound of menace, their horses' hooves breaking the stillness of the snow-blanketed prairie. Sarah stepped outside, her shawl clutched tightly, heart pounding as three men reined in near the cabin. Their eyes were sharp, their laughter rough, the kind of men who thrived on fear. One tipped his hat with mock courtesy, his scarred face twisting into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Afternoon, ma'am. We're looking for a friend of ours. Tall fellow, fine clothes, might have passed through here." His voice carried the oily weight of deceit. Sarah's hands trembled within her shawl, but she steadied her breath and stood firm, remembering William's lessons in courage. Her children were hidden, their wide eyes watching from the root cellar. Inside, the stranger they had saved sat upright, every nerve taut, listening. Sarah met the rider's gaze without flinching. "No one like that has come by. We don't get many visitors." Her voice was even, though her heart thundered in her ears. The scarred man studied her face, searching for cracks, but she held steady, her expression calm as a frozen pond. At length, he spat into the snow and signaled the others. "Mind if we look around?" he pressed. "I do mind," Sarah replied, her voice firm though her knees weakened beneath her. "My children are inside, and I don't allow strange men near them. You've had your answer." Good day." For a tense moment, silence reigned, broken only by the restless snorts of the horses. Then, with a shrug that dripped with unspoken threats, the men wheeled their mounts and rode off, their shadows stretching long across the snow. Sarah waited until they disappeared over the ridge before allowing her shoulders to sag. She closed the door, her hands shaking, and leaned against the wood as the tremor of fear caught up with her. From the back room came the sound of movement. The stranger, James Harrison, though she did not yet know his full name, stood in the shadows, his wound forgotten in the heat of danger. His eyes met hers, a silent exchange of gratitude and guilt. That night, when the children slept, Sarah placed a cup of willow bark tea before him and demanded the truth. His face, pale from recovery but strong with resolve, softened. "Those men aren't my friends," he admitted, his cultured voice quiet but steady. "They work for Marcus Blackwood, a man who's been after my ranch for years. And this wound," he touched his side gently, "is his latest persuasion." Sarah's breath caught as he revealed the deed folded in his coat, marked with the name Double H, one of the largest ranches in the territory. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces she had glimpsed, his fine clothes, his bearing, the scars that spoke of old battles, fell into place. He was no ordinary wanderer. He was a man hunted because he refused to surrender what he had built. But beneath his wealth and his fight lay something more. As Sarah listened, she saw grief flicker in his gaze when he spoke of Margaret, his late wife, whose name he had whispered in fever. The pocket watch she had found with its inscription was a relic of a love lost, as raw and healing as the ache she carried for William. In his story, she recognized her own. The cruel theft of dreams, the ache of empty nights, the struggle to raise hope from the ashes of sorrow. And in that recognition, a thread of connection wound quietly between them. Over the days that followed, James grew stronger. His blue eyes regained clarity, his voice steadied, and he began to rise from the pallet, leaning on the furniture for support. Emma read aloud to him by the fire, her young voice carrying words of arithmetic and scripture, while Thomas showed him the wooden horse he had been carving. James admired it with genuine wonder, offering tips on shaping, sanding, and balance, as though teaching was second nature. "Every good horse needs a good owner," he told the boy, handing him a finer carving knife from his own saddlebag. "Think you can care for both?" Thomas nodded solemnly, pride glowing in his face. Sarah watched, her heart stirred by the sight of her children, drawn to this stranger with the ease of long-lost kin. In the evenings, when the fire crackled low, Sarah often found James studying the cabin with thoughtful eyes. He noticed the patched clothes, the sagging roof, the worn table polished smooth by years of use. Yet he never spoke of pity. Instead, he spoke of strength, of admiration for how she managed to keep her family alive when the world conspired against her. One night, as she mended a sleeve by lamplight, he said quietly, "Your children are bright, disciplined, and kind. That doesn't happen by chance. It happens because of you." The words sank deep, like balm on a wound she hadn't known still bled. Sarah felt herself softening in ways that frightened her. She caught herself lingering near him, her breath faltering when his eyes held hers longer than necessary. She remembered William's laugh, his promises, the love they had shared, and guilt twisted with the new warmth budding in her chest. Love was dangerous, unpredictable, and she had sworn her heart would remain a fortress. But James, without pressing, without asking, was dismantling the walls stone by stone, simply by seeing her as she was, strong, imperfect, but alive. The prairie itself seemed to sense the shift. Snow melted into spring, the wheat fields whispering with promise, the air carrying scents of damp earth and renewal. Yet along with healing came the echo of danger. Rumors reached town of Blackwood's men pressing harder, watching, waiting. And one evening, as the sun dipped low, Sarah heard the thunder of hooves again. Not the sound of menace this time, but of James stepping outside with Thomas, teaching him how to read the land, how to track the weather in the tilt of the clouds. Their voices carried back to the cabin, steady and warm, and Sarah felt her heart tremble. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking of survival alone. She was thinking of what it meant to live, to feel whole, to allow love, slowly, gently, to bloom again. And so, while shadows gathered at the edges of the horizon, inside that little cabin on the Montana prairie, healing had begun. What started as the act of saving a stranger's life was becoming something greater. The weaving of two broken lives into one fabric, stitched with trust, resilience, and the quiet, unstoppable growth of hope. As the season turned, Sarah knew she was standing at the edge of a new chapter, one that would test every part of her heart, yet also teach her how to open it again. Spring poured itself over the Montana plains with a gentleness that felt like an answered prayer, and within the Collins homestead, life seemed to breathe again. James had regained his strength enough to walk the yard each morning, his steps cautious but steady, while Sarah's children followed him like shadows, eager for light. Emma clutched her schoolbooks, asking him questions that spilled out in quick succession, about numbers, about cattle, about the faraway places he had seen. James listened with patience, offering her lessons not only in sums and records, but in confidence, telling her that a sharp mind was as valuable as any strong arm. Thomas, too, bloomed under his guidance. His small hands guided over wood and knife as James showed him how to carve with precision, to turn simple blocks into shapes that seemed to breathe. These were not grand gestures, but they were healing ones, soft stitches in the fabric of a family that had frayed too close to tearing. Sarah watched them with quiet awe. She had prayed her children would not lose their innocence too quickly. That hardship would not rob them of the laughter she remembered from brighter days. Now laughter returned. Emma's triumphant cheer when she mastered a long division problem, Thomas's grin when his carved horse finally stood balanced on 4 legs. Even the walls of the old cabin seemed to warm with the sound, as though memory itself was soothed. And yet, alongside her gratitude, Sarah felt the stirring of something deeper. Each glance James gave her children carried both admiration and longing, the unmistakable ache of a man who once dreamed of being a father and had been denied. Each time his eyes met hers, Sarah sensed the same recognition. They were two souls scarred by loss, yet refusing to let grief claim the last of their light. Evenings by the fire became moments of quiet communion. James shared stories of cattle drives under endless skies, of storms that split the horizon with fire, of friendships forged on dusty trails, and battles fought to protect what was his. His voice carried strength, but also shadows. There were things he did not say, scars too deep for casual telling. Sarah listened, sometimes with the children nestled at her side, sometimes alone after they slept. She found herself offering pieces of her own story in return. The barn raising where she met William, the nights they dreamed of the future as they hammered beams into place, the ache of waking each morning to an empty bed. She spoke not to replace her husband's memory, but to honor it, and James received her words with reverence, never pressing, never diminishing. One night, as the firelight danced on the walls, Sarah noticed him tracing the edge of a photograph he carried, a woman's face, smiling softly, her hand resting on his shoulder in younger days. Margaret. The name lingered in the silence between them. He confessed then, his voice raw, that she had died 8 years ago, taken by fever with the child she carried. The Double H, he explained, had been built for her, a dream turned monument to a love cut short. His eyes held shadows as he spoke, but also a fragile brightness as he added, "I thought that when she died, so did I. But your family, you've reminded me what it feels like to live." Sarah's heart swelled with a tide she could not resist. Grief recognized grief. Love recognized love. And in their shared sorrow they discovered not emptiness but possibility. She reached across the space between them, her hand brushing his for the briefest moment, and the warmth of that touch was more profound than any kiss. It was a promise, unspoken but undeniable, that healing had begun not just for him, but for her as well. The children noticed, though they said nothing. Emma's eyes lit up each time James praised her work, and Thomas followed him with unguarded trust. One afternoon, while teaching the boy how to whittle a smoother curve, James accidentally called him son. The word slipped out naturally, heavy with meaning, and though Thomas sat a little straighter at the sound, James did not take it back. Sarah heard it too, and her breath caught. In that simple word lay the truth she had been circling for weeks. This man was no longer just a guest or a burden. He was becoming part of them, filling spaces they hadn't known were empty. When whispers in town began about the wealthy rancher spending so much time at the widow's homestead, Sarah felt the sting of judgment, but also the strength to withstand it. James's calm dismissal of gossip gave her courage. People who have never known struggle are quick to judge those who have, he told her, his tone both firm and tender. She realized then that his presence did more than mend their barn or teach her children. It steadied her own spirit, reminded her that dignity was not measured by wealth or by others' opinions, but by the choices one made in love and loyalty. As summer ripened into autumn, the bonds grew unshakable. The children rode the gentle horses James had brought, their laughter echoing across the fields. Sarah watched them race across the pasture with hearts unburdened, and she felt joy so sharp it nearly hurt. Beside her, James stood close, his hand brushing hers as naturally as breathing. Neither pulled away. Their eyes met, and in the warmth of that glance, the past no longer felt like a chain, but a foundation upon which something new could grow. And grow it did, quietly, tenderly, like morning glories curling upward toward light. What had begun as survival was turning into a life worth living again, each day layering trust upon affection, grief upon hope, until the weight no longer crushed but steadied them. Sarah did not yet call it love aloud, but she knew. It was in the way her children said "Papa" without hesitation, in the way her own heart eased when James entered a room, in the way his presence filled the silence once occupied by despair. Yet even as the homestead blossomed, shadows still lingered at the edges of their days. Blackwood's men had not been vanquished, only delayed, and Sarah sensed the storm to come. But this time she did not tremble. This time she knew she would not face it alone. With James by her side, with her children strengthened by his guidance, she felt a courage she had not known before, a courage born not from the absence of fear, but from the healing power of love that had chosen to rise again. And as the first chill winds of another Montana winter crept across the land, Sarah knew the true test of their newfound bond was waiting just beyond the horizon. The storm arrived without warning, sweeping down from the mountains like a fury loosed from heaven. The sky turned green-black, the kind of color that makes the heart seize with ancient fear, and the air grew heavy until even the cattle lowed in restless alarm. Sarah stood at the window, the hair on her arms rising, when Emma burst through the door, shouting that James was riding hard across the field. His voice followed close behind, urgent above the wind. "Storm cellar, now!" The next moments were a blur of movement, the family working as one body, each step echoing the drills James had taught them in calmer days. Thomas rushed to the barn with James to steady the horses, while Emma gathered the lanterns and water jars that Sarah had kept ready since William's time. Sarah herself ran into the gale, skirts whipping like torn sails, her hands helping James force frightened animals into stalls. Lightning cracked above, splitting the sky, and in its blinding flash, Sarah saw the barn's main beam split as if by an axe. The groan of timber shook the air. "Out, now!" James shouted, shoving Thomas clear of the danger, but the collapsing beam caught James across the shoulder, dropping him to his knees. Sarah screamed his name, rushing toward him through the chaos. His face was pale with pain, yet his eyes burned steady. "The rope!" he gasped, pointing toward the wall. In that instant, Sarah remembered every lesson he had insisted they learn: emergency braces, rope pulleys, quick knots. With Emma's small hands already racing for the poles and Thomas steadying the rope, the family moved as though guided by one heart. Sarah's fingers, though trembling, tied knots with a swiftness born of desperation, pulling the rope until the failing beam held fast against the gale. Rain poured through the cracked roof, drenching them all, but the barn stood. James staggered upright, his injured arm cradled against his side, a grim smile flashing through the storm. "Never thought I'd be grateful for practice drills," he muttered, his pride shining even in pain. Sarah met his eyes through the rain, her breath caught by the strength she saw there, and for a heartbeat the storm around them faded into the background. Together they fled to the storm cellar, where the children huddled close as the tornado roared above, tearing across the land like a beast hungry for ruin. The earth shook, the walls groaned, and yet within that cramped space, Sarah felt a strange calm. Her hands pressed against James's shoulder, checking for dislocation, relief flooding her when she realized it was only bruised. He winced, but caught her hand in his good one, holding it tightly. "Worth it," he whispered, voice low and warm, "to see how you all moved together, stronger than fear." The children spoke softly in the lamplight, their voices trembling but proud. Emma said they were less afraid now, because James had taught them that preparation was stronger than fear. Thomas added firmly that family takes care of each other, no matter the storm. James's breath hitched, and Sarah felt the squeeze of his hand grow stronger. In that instant, she understood that what had been tested in the barn was not just timber and rope, but the fragile fabric of a new family being woven before her eyes. When dawn came, they emerged to find the land scarred but alive. The barn, though wounded, stood tall, its lightning-scorched beam now a symbol of their unity. The house still held, the fields bent but not broken. Sarah stood with her children beside James, his arm bandaged and his body leaning against her strength, and knew the storm had proven something more than survival. It had proven belonging. That evening, when the house was quiet and the children finally slept, Sarah found herself alone with James near the fire. His journal slipped from his pocket as he shifted, the leather worn from years of handling. When she bent to retrieve it, the book fell open to a page where her family's names were written in his hand. She hesitated, then glanced at him, but he only nodded gently, his eyes soft. "No secrets between us," he said. And so she read, his words full of grief for Margaret, for years of loneliness, but also full of awe for Emma and Thomas, for the resilience he saw in Sarah, for the healing he had found beneath their humble roof. Her heart trembled as he admitted, "I thought I'd buried every chance of joy with her. But your family has taught me how to breathe again. Sometimes I think she led me here." Sarah closed the journal with reverent hands, tears burning her eyes, and whispered, "Maybe William did too." The silence between them then was not empty, but full. Of memory, of love lost and found, of hope quietly blooming like morning glories curling toward the sun. James lifted her hand to his lips, his voice hushed. "I never thought I could love again, but I do. Not to replace what we lost, but to honor it, to build something new with you." Sarah's breath caught, her heart thundering in her chest, as though answering a truth she had long kept hidden. Her eyes met his, steady, unafraid, and for the first time she allowed herself to admit it, not just to him, but to herself. She loved him too. The flames crackled, casting golden warmth across their faces, and though outside the land still bore the scars of storm, inside the cabin healing had become something greater than survival. It had become love, tender and fierce, a promise rising stronger than wind, brighter than lightning, steadier than any storm that might come again. And as Sarah rested her head against James's uninjured shoulder, listening to his steady heartbeat, she knew this was not an ending, but a beginning, carrying them forward into trials yet unseen, bound by a love that had already proven it could weather the fiercest of nights. Autumn ripened across the Montana plains with a golden hush, the wheat fields bending under the weight of harvest, the air scented with wood smoke and ripe apples. The Collins homestead, once weary with despair, now pulsed with new life. Timber rose where walls had sagged, fences stretched firm across the fields, and laughter echoed daily from the corral where Emma and Thomas practiced riding beneath James's patient gaze. The scars of storm and sorrow still marked the land and their hearts, but they had become reminders of endurance rather than ruins of loss. Sarah stood at the edge of the field one afternoon, her apron brushed with flour from bread-making, watching her children ride in wide circles. Emma's back was straight, her hair whipping like a banner in the wind, her face alight with joy. Thomas leaned forward, whispering encouragement to his horse, as if speaking to a dear friend, and the animal obeyed with trust. James leaned against the fence post nearby, his injured shoulder still tender but healing, his eyes following the children with pride so raw it made Sarah's breath catch. When he turned toward her, their gazes met, and she saw it there. Love, steady and unshaken, no longer hidden in silence, but glowing in every line of his face. Their evenings carried a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Emma would bring her books to the table, eager to master new sums and words, while James leaned over her shoulder, showing her how numbers could shape the patterns of cattle breeding or crop rotations. Thomas, knife in hand, sat near the hearth, carving ever more intricate horses, his progress marked by smoother lines and careful details. Sometimes James joined him, showing him finer techniques, their voices mingling in quiet concentration. Sarah stitched clothes by lamplight, her needle moving in rhythm with their voices, her heart warmed by the healing peace that filled the room. Yet the heart does not heal by ease alone. It heals also by truth. One evening, as Sarah folded laundry, James drew a breath heavy with meaning and spoke of Margaret again. He told of their meeting at a charity auction, of how she had convinced him to give more than he planned, of her laughter that could soften the hardest day. His voice faltered when he described her last moments, the fever that stole both her and their unborn child, leaving him wandering halls of the Double H in silence. Sarah listened, her own tears falling not from jealousy, but from compassion, from recognition of grief's long shadow. When he finished, she shared her own stories of William, the barn raising where he first took her hand, the winter nights they dreamed of their children's futures, the ache of his sudden death. Their words wove together like threads of two broken fabrics, creating something whole, something tender, something healing. The children, too, carried their share of truth into the growing bond. One night, Thomas fell asleep against James's arm after a long day of mending fences. In his half-dreaming voice, he whispered, "Papa." The words slipped from him as naturally as breath, and James froze, his eyes meeting Sarah's across the fire. Tears glistened in his gaze, not of sorrow, but of something sacred. Sarah, her throat tight, only nodded once, her heart acknowledging what her son had already chosen. Emma, too, began to speak of James not as visitor, but as anchor. She sought his counsel as she once had longed for her father's, her questions filled with trust. Their acceptance was not forced, nor coaxed. It was born of the steady kindness he had given freely, and it rooted itself as firmly as the morning glories Emma had planted along the porch. It was during the harvest festival that Sarah felt the truth settle fully into her chest. The community, once suspicious of gossip, now welcomed her family with softened eyes, their whispers turned into admiration at the resilience she had shown and the transformation of her land under James's guidance. James stood beside her that night, his arm steadying her as lantern light painted the sky, his presence both protector and equal. When they danced beneath the stars, Sarah's heart no longer trembled with guilt. She knew William's memory was not diminished by this love. It was honored, for love that endures grief becomes love that can bloom again. In the days that followed, James spoke more openly of the future. He showed Sarah architectural plans for new barns and a parlor where quilting circles could gather. He spoke of education for the children, not only for Emma and Thomas, but for every child in the district, his vision extending beyond their home into the wider community. Sarah listened with awe, knowing this was not charity, but partnership. His plans were not built to rescue her, but to build with her, to take her strength and weave it into something larger. One evening, as they stood watching Emma ride her first proper trot, James spoke softly beside her. "Sarah, when I came here, I thought I was bleeding out my last breath. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. But you and your children, you've given me life again." His voice trembled slightly, but his eyes were steady, filled with devotion. Sarah reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, and she whispered back, "And you've given us back our hope." In that moment, with the prairie stretching wide around them and the laughter of their children ringing across the fields, Sarah felt the fullness of healing. Love, tested by grief, was becoming whole again. The nights grew colder, winter's edge approaching, but inside the cabin warmth reigned. Warmth not only of fire, but of hearts knit together. James's presence was no longer that of a stranger or even a guest. He was a part of them, bound by trust, by sacrifice, by affection that had grown into something unshakable. The scars on his body mirrored the scars in Sarah's heart, but both had become reminders of survival, of endurance, of the miracle that life could begin again. And though the horizon still carried the threat of Blackwood's shadow, Sarah no longer feared it. Whatever storms might come, they would face them not as broken souls clinging to fragments, but as a family, whole, healing, and stronger together. And so the days turned, each one a step further from loss, and closer to a future neither had dared to dream. As the first snowflakes of the new season drifted across the fields, Sarah looked out from the porch with James's hand warm in hers and felt peace settle into her bones. This was no longer just survival. This was love reborn, patient and tender, ready to weather whatever trials lay ahead. And as night fell, she knew their journey was only just beginning, carrying them toward trials, triumphs, and joys that would test and deepen the love already rooted deep within their hearts. Winter laid its white hand upon the land, yet the Collins homestead glowed with a life that defied the cold. The cabin, once draughty and worn, now stood strong with new beams, the barn repaired, and the fences stretching straight across fields sleeping under snow. Inside, warmth pulsed not only from the hearth, but from the closeness of hearts bound by choice and by love. James moved among them no longer as guest, but as anchor, his presence as natural as the ticking of the clock or the steady crackle of wood. Evenings were richest, the kind that wrapped themselves around memory and wove it into promise. The Anderson family, who had lost their cabin to fire, had been welcomed into the Collins home, filling the rooms with extra laughter, children's chatter, and the kind of chaos that proved love multiplies rather than divides. Emma shared her books with Mary Anderson, teaching her sums with the same pride James had once shown her. Thomas guided young Billy through carving his first toy horse, his patience echoing the lessons James had planted in him. Sarah watched with quiet joy, her heart swelling to see her children not only healed, but healing others, their resilience flowering into generosity. James had become the steady pillar in all of it. He worked alongside Mr. Anderson to sketch plans for rebuilding their cabin, his knowledge of timber and engineering guiding hands that had nearly given up. In the evenings, he taught both families songs his mother once sang at Christmas, melodies that blended Swedish prayers from Mrs. Anderson and hymns Sarah remembered from her childhood. The house rang with harmony, and for the first time since William's passing, Sarah felt Christmas approaching not as a reminder of loss, but as a promise of renewal. One evening, when the air outside sparkled with frost and the scent of pine cones and baking bread filled the cabin, James placed a leather-bound book in Sarah's hands. Its cover was tooled with morning glories, delicate yet strong, a symbol that had become their own. "So you may write your family's story," he said softly, his eyes luminous in the lamplight. "So your children and their children will know how love can rise again." Sarah traced the flowers with her fingertips, tears burning her eyes, and whispered her thanks. That night she opened its first page and wrote, "Today we learned that home stretches to hold what love requires." The children, in their own innocence, carried forward the truth adults struggled to speak. On a snowy morning, they presented James with a carved wooden box, inside which lay William's ring. Emma's voice shook, but held steady as she said, "We thought maybe it's time it had a new purpose." Thomas added, "Papa would want you to have it. You keep us safe, like he did." The word Papa lingered in the air, not forced, but born from the trust of their hearts. James's breath faltered, his eyes filling, and Sarah, with tears glistening on her cheeks, laid her hand over his. In that moment, grief and love did not clash. They joined, transforming loss into foundation. Later, beneath the hush of night, James spoke of adoption papers he had quietly prepared, offering Emma and Thomas the choice to carry both their fathers' names, Collins to honor William, Harrison to mark the new life they were building. Sarah's heart ached and healed all at once, for in this gesture she saw not the erasure of the past, but its continuation, love stretching wide enough to hold what had been and what was yet to come. The children's joy at the thought was radiant, and their acceptance sealed a truth none could deny. They were a family now, forged not just by blood, but by love freely chosen. When James asked Sarah to marry him, it was not beneath chandeliers or grand gestures, but in the humble heart of the cabin they had rebuilt together. He held William's ring, his voice steady with devotion, and spoke not of replacing what was lost, but of honoring it by building something new. Sarah's answer, given through tears and laughter, was yes. Their children's cheers filled the room, and the promise of tomorrow settled into the warmth of their joined hands. As preparations for the wedding began, the entire community seemed to take part. Neighbors offered flowers. Mrs. Peterson gifted lace that had belonged to her grandmother, and the Andersons carved lanterns to hang from the rafters of the barn, now transformed into a hall of celebration. Gossip turned to admiration, whispers to blessings, for all who had doubted now saw the truth. Love, when rooted in sacrifice and kindness, could transform even the harshest of winters into a season of healing. On the morning of their vows, the sky stretched clear and endless, the fields glittering with snow that caught the light like diamonds. Emma and Thomas stood proudly beside their mother, their faces glowing with joy, as James spoke not only his promises to Sarah, but to them too. He gifted them pocket watches, engraved with their chosen names, telling them they were his children, not by obligation, but by love. Sarah's vows followed, her voice trembling yet strong, speaking of carrying the past with honor while stepping into the future with courage. When they sealed their vows with a kiss, there was not a dry eye among the gathered, for it was not only a wedding, but a renewal of faith in what life could give after sorrow. That night, as lanterns glowed and laughter rose beneath the rafters. Sarah looked across the room at James, their children dancing, neighbors celebrating, and felt peace so complete it seemed to settle into her very bones. Love had returned, not as a fleeting miracle, but as a steady flame, one that promised to burn through every season to come. And as dawn began to paint the horizon in pale gold, Sarah knew their story was no longer just about survival. It was about love reborn, healing carried forward, and a family made whole by the power of second chances. The snow outside whispered of trials still to come, shadows still to face, but Sarah no longer feared them. For within her home was strength, within her arms was love, and beside her heart was a man who had once been a stranger, but was now her husband, her partner, her healing. Together they would step into whatever waited beyond the horizon, knowing that love, once chosen, was stronger than any storm. And with that certainty, the promise of the next chapter glowed like morning glories waiting to bloom. The seasons turned once more, carrying the Collins-Harrison family into a rhythm of life that felt as if it had always been theirs. Morning glories wound their vines around the porch posts, bursting into bloom each dawn with colors of violet and blue, a daily reminder that love, like the flowers, was born anew every morning. The ranch thrived, fields ripe with grain, cattle strong in the pastures, children riding with confidence and skill as though born to the saddle. What once had been a widow's fight for survival had become a household filled with laughter, warmth, and the steady pulse of hope. Sarah often found herself pausing in the doorway, her hands still from their tasks, simply to watch the life unfolding before her eyes. Emma, now older and wiser, balanced her schoolwork with ranch accounts, her sharp mind guiding breeding records and crop plans. Thomas spent long afternoons in the workshop, wood shavings at his feet, his hands shaping cradles, chairs, and toys with the quiet confidence of a craftsman. Their joy was her joy, their dreams no longer limited by hunger or fear, but expanded by the security James had helped weave into their lives. Healing, she realized, was not just recovery, it was growth, expansion, the courage to dream again. James himself had changed. No longer the haunted figure who had collapsed in her field, he now carried his past with grace rather than grief. The Double H and the Morning Glory Ranch stood side by side, not as empires of wealth, but as havens of family and community. He poured his strength into building not only fences and barns, but also futures, schools for the district, new opportunities for neighbors, a community tied together by compassion. In the evenings, as he sat with Sarah on the porch swing, his arm around her shoulders, he would say softly, "Wealth without purpose is just weight, but with love, it becomes legacy." Their love deepened not in fiery declarations, but in the quiet moments that mattered most. When Sarah placed her hand over his as they watched the children play, when James kissed her temple after a long day's work, when the family gathered by the fire, voices mingling in songs carried from one generation to the next. These were the threads that wove their lives together, strong and unbreakable. Grief had shaped them, but healing had given them back the courage to embrace joy. Winter returned, but this time the cold did not bite with despair. The house was warm, the barn secure, and the pantry full. On Christmas Eve, the Andersons joined them again, their rebuilt cabin a testament to resilience. Together they decorated the parlor, strung cranberries, sang carols, and exchanged gifts made by hand. James presented Sarah with a new journal, its cover embossed with wheat stalks twining among morning glories, a symbol of their two legacies entwined. Sarah, in turn, gave him a blanket she had sewn from scraps of both William's and James's old coats, patchwork of past and present, bound into something whole. Tears glistened in his eyes as he wrapped it around his shoulders, pulling her into its warmth with him. The children, with youthful certainty, had already begun writing their own futures. Emma spoke often of becoming a ranch manager, her fire and brilliance unmistakable. Thomas dreamed of building homes, his love for woodworking blossoming with each creation. Sarah and James listened, their pride swelling, knowing that their children's dreams would carry the light of both their fathers. William's gentle steadfastness, James's resilient strength. Healing had given them back not only hope, but purpose. One quiet spring morning, as Sarah walked the fields with James at her side, her hand resting lightly on the curve of her growing belly, she realized how far they had come. From widowhood and loneliness to laughter and abundance, from storm and danger to peace and belonging, their journey was a testament to love's power to transform. She smiled, lifting her face to the sky, whispering thanks for second chances, for resilience, for the beauty of healing that had carried them all into this new chapter. James pressed a kiss to her forehead, his voice low and reverent. "This is what I never thought I'd find again. Home, family, love." And as the prairie wind carried the scent of wildflowers across the land, Sarah knew their story was not simply theirs. It was a reminder to anyone who listened that love can bloom even in barren soil, that healing is always possible, and that hope is never truly lost. If this story has brought you comfort, if it has reminded you of the healing power of love and the beauty of second chances, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let your heart press that gentle like and subscribe to walk with me through more tales of resilience, family, and romance that warm the soul. Your voice, your presence, and your kindness keep these stories alive, growing like morning glories in the light of a new day.